It's a Woman Crush Wednesday. Join Professor Buzzkill as he crushes on women from history who deserve more fame and glory.
Yes, Buzzkillers, indeed. It is a Woman Crush Wednesday, and fortunately for you, we have on the line via the internets Dr. Lydia Moland from Colby College up there in Maine. It's very beautiful up there. And she's here to talk to us about Lydia Maria Child, one of the most important early abolitionists in this country, and someone who definitely deserves more fame and glory. Hello, Dr. Moland. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, I didn't know anything about Lydia Maria Child except one thing, and I didn't know it was her. And it's sort of the most famous thing about her, but it's something we actually really need to get out of the way.
Absolutely.
So that we can move on to more important things. What is she most famous for?
She is most famous for writing the poem that every American school child knows, "Over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go."
Right.
Sometimes it's grandmother, but sometimes it's grandfather. But yes, she wrote that poem.
But we have bigger news, let's say that,
Yes, we do.
about her. She was extremely active in the early 19th century in all kinds of important reform movements. So rather than me just gushing about how interesting I found her when I started researching her, I'd rather turn it over to you and talk about what not only her life and her work in these reform movements, but what was going on with other people at the time.
Yes, thank you. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that I'd like to make sure that we don't perpetuate any myths that we want to get away from thinking about abolitionism. So when I decided to write this book, I knew that one of the risks was perpetuating the myth that abolitionism was generally led by white people. Mm-hmm. Lydia Maria Child was a white woman. But it is absolutely not true that most abolitionists were white or that the foundations of the abolition movement were with white people.
And of course, when we're talking about American history, abolition almost always means the abolition of slavery.
That's right.
In other countries, it can mean the abolition of certain taxes or the abolition of alcohol, all kinds of things. But definitely abolition of slavery is what we're all about.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. So most of your listeners will have heard of names like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, but there were many very prominent, very active Black abolitionists, including people like Mariah Stewart and David Walker, who were both in Boston that Child would have read. They were both published in The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's paper, but also Mary Ann Shadd Cary and Sarah Mapps Douglas and David Ruggles, Charles Raymond. And I just really encourage your listeners to read about them too. There are historians doing wonderful work about them. I'll just mention a couple. Kelly Carter Jackson, thing that she says is Black abolitionists served as the engine for the movement and set the tone for envisioning freedom. I love that, to set the tone for envisioning freedom. But also Carrie Greenidge and Manisha Sinha, obviously Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones. So there's wonderful work being done on Black abolitionists, and I'd really encourage your listeners to learn more about them as well.
And it's important that you're saying this up front, because for generations and generations and generations, we've had this sort of white savior story.
Exactly.
And, there are a number of very important white people involved in the abolition of slavery movement. And on our show, we've done episodes about Levi Coffin and his wife in Indiana, who were great Underground Railroad pioneers and great sort of linchpins for that movement. But fortunately, because of all these historians working on this stuff in the last 40 years, we've begun to learn that the balance really is on the African-American side.
Absolutely. And I think when we perpetuate the myth, the white savior myth, we do a lot of damage. We neglect people who need more attention, but we also neglect to talk about the ways in which what most white people then were complicit in slavery. And many white people now are complicit in racial injustice. And I think anytime we tell a kind of savior narrative, we just as an aesthetic matter, invite people to identify with the saviors. And so most of us walk away thinking, yeah, if I had lived then, I would have been an abolitionist. And I don't think we should be so sure about that.
Yeah, it's just almost as likely that you might be involved, your family might be financially invested.
Yeah, absolutely.
In things about slavery, even in Boston and other places in the North.
Absolutely.
But we are talking today about someone, a white person in the North, Lydia Maria Child. How does she start getting involved in these radical movements and using these radical ideas to help further the abolitionist cause?
She was born out in Medford, Massachusetts, which is near Boston, in 1802. Her father was a baker, so she grew up very working class, but she loved books. She was a prodigious reader. She was self-educated very quickly. And by her early 20s, she had already published a couple of very successful novels and a very successful anthology for children that had fiction and nonfiction and poems and riddles and all games, that kind of thing. And she was also editing the first periodical of its kind for children called the Juvenile Miscellany.
Right.
And then in 1829, she wrote something called The Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy.
Yeah, that was actually her phrase, right?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, and it's a very combative phrase already, right? I'm not ashamed of my economy, and this book is not for you if you're not. It was a really pioneering book in the American self-help tradition. So her idea was that for a democracy to function, people needed to be self-sufficient. And this meant that they should know how to make their own soap and brew their own beer and roast their own geese and cure dysentery and get rid of ticks and, all kinds of things. All of which to say that by the time she was in her late 20s, she was the equivalent of a household name. She was a beloved author, and people really turned to her for advice and guidance. That's the kind of reputation she had. So then in 1830, she met William Lloyd Garrison.
Right. We should remind the Buzzkillers who he is. We have an awful lot of foreign listeners.
Sure, absolutely. So William Lloyd Garrison was another white Northerner who came to Boston after living in the South for a while, determined to dedicate his life to ending slavery. And he did that in part by doing something that was rather rare for white Northerners. He listened to the Black community.
Yes, that's
right.
So
the Black community in Boston was very clear that colonization, which was the idea that emancipated slaves should be sent out of the country, was not what they wanted, not going to work. They were very clear with him that emancipation should be immediate and complete. And he listened, he took on these positions, and then he started The Liberator, which was this very famous weekly newspaper, became very well known and was really controversial and reviled from the start.
Oh, absolutely.
Garrison took no prisoners. He was not interested in making people feel good. He was an attack dog in, the best possible way, in the cause of justice. And he was a brilliant rhetorician. He used arguments brilliantly. So he converted Lydia Maria Child to abolition. And it was very clear that he sought her out. He knew who she was. He knew what kind of reputation she had. He knew if he could get her on his side, he would have an extremely powerful weapon. So sure enough, she then had to decide what she had to offer the movement. Now that she was convinced that slavery was evil and should be ended immediately, she had to decide what she had to offer the movement. And she decided that what she had was her reputation as a beloved and trustworthy author.
Right.
So she spent the next 3 years of her life researching and writing a book called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans.
Right.
This book was a buzz-killing book. This is why, to be honest, I think she's such a great topic for your show. She loved busting myths and taking names.
Yeah, great.
And this book, it was divided into chapters, and each chapter busted some myth. So chapter 1 was about the history of slavery. And she painstakingly shows that American slavery was worse than any other kind of slavery in the history of the world. In chapter 2, she takes on economics, and she busts the myths that slave economies were more productive than economies based on free labor. She makes it very clear that having enslaved labor was corrupting the economy rather than bolstering it. There's a chapter on politics in which she, makes Northerners aware that their politicians, far from being the noble and praiseworthy people that they'd been convinced they were cowardly and compromising in the face of Southern bullying, essentially.
Right.
And then there are 2 chapters, both on what she called Negroes, videos, one on their intellectual character and one on their moral character,
right.
in which, again, she just systematically destroys the myth that Africans and their descendants are inferior. And she does that by finding examples. She finds, scientists and poets and generals and politicians who were Black and praising Toussaint Louverture. And so that myth also gone. But the one that it still kind of takes my breath away is the last chapter, which is called Prejudices Against People of Color and Our Duties in Relation to This Subject. Mm-hmm. So can I just read the first sentence?
Please do, yeah.
So it goes like this. While we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the system of slavery, let us not flatter ourselves that we are in reality any better than our brethren of the South. The form of slavery does not exist among us, but the very spirit of the hateful and mischievous thing is here in all its strength.
Right.
And then it's just like she wheels her cannon around and aims it at her own hometown. And she's ruthless. She's relentless. She says Northerners are complicit in slavery. Slavery would not survive without Northern money, without Northern politics, and without Northern prejudice. Mm-hmm. So she talks about Boston fortunes being built off the blood of African slaves, but she also says it's Bostonians who won't allow Black parishioners in their churches, who won't allow them in stagecoaches, who won't allow them in hotels. It's white Northerners who burn down schools for Black children. That is what is upholding slavery in this country.
Yeah, there's a great deal of this going on in the North. And also there's the great deal of the superior notion that because we're Northerners, this is, of course, at the time, the 1820s and 30s, we're Northerners, we are better than the Southerners because we're not doing this. When, as you point out, and lots of people point out, the indirect support of slavery is just as evil.
Absolutely. And, I think then as now, Northerners like to think that slavery and racism is a Southern problem. And she was just 100% clear that that was false. So as you can imagine, this didn't go over well in the North. And she was, I would say, the 19th century equivalent of canceled.
Okay.
She lost her readership. People stopped reading her books. They went out of print. She lost the editorship of the Juvenile Miscellany. Friends stopped speaking to her. She no longer got invitations to high society functions. She fell out with one of her brothers. She essentially spent much of the rest of her life in principled poverty because she could never get her writing career back off the ground.
But she still, throughout the 40s and even into the 50s, she kept writing about slavery. It's just another book doesn't come out. She's publishing in the National Anti-Slavery Standard. She's doing all sorts of writing that way. But her drawing room literature evaporates, and therefore her reputation and her connections with it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's essentially right. And she was incredibly prolific. So she also, during this period, wrote a 2-volume history of women, a 3-volume history of religion. Mm-hmm. She wrote several other self-help books. So she did continue to publish, but much of her public never really forgave her for that. So she was still a successful author by the end of the century, but was never quite the kind of career that she had originally foreseen.
May I ask, because she does write about women's rights a lot, and she's works with Lucretia Mott and Maria Weston Chapman, but she's very clear that she believes that women's rights must wait, and women's suffrage certainly must wait, until African Americans have rights. And that's not always the case in different suffrage groups. Lots of them feel that white women should be getting the rights first and then African Americans later, if at all.
Absolutely. There was never like an official rupture between her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But at a certain point, Child just stopped supporting Stanton because Stanton was one of them who decided that if she had to throw Black Americans under the bus in order to get her own voting first, she would, and started making extremely racist comments and scaring white people out of allowing Black people to vote. And Child never went along with any of that. And part of what's really painful about that is that that wasn't the first time that Child had watched a schism split a movement. That happened a couple of times in her career, and it was always extremely painful to her to watch that happen.
Is it fair to say that in the 1840s, her star diminishes somewhat, at least in terms of what you call polite society, or that because of turning that cannon on her own back on her own area. But then in the 1850s, of course, she reacts very strongly to Preston Brooks beating Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, which is one of the things that provokes a lot of Northern backlash against Southerners. She has a lot to say about what's going on in Kansas, bleeding Kansas. And the 1850s seem to be extreme. There's sort of almost a re-energization, or am I reading too much into it?
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think the trajectory of her career would go something like this. She had incredible energy for abolitionist work starting in the 1830s all the way through the early 1840s. But then she had a real falling out with some other abolitionists, including Maria Weston Chapman,
right.
who was one of her good friends. And she was so bruised and defeated by that she withdrew from official abolitionist associations for about a decade. And she continued to work against slavery in many other ways. But you're right, it was really in the 1850s. So she had, I would say, about a decade of real depression.
Wow.
Where it looked like the abolitionist cause had just failed, and therefore everything she dedicated her life to and ruined her career for had failed. I also think it's important to remember that while people like her could step back for a while and rejuvenate, Black abolitionists could not do that. So, it was an excruciatingly difficult time for her, but she was still able to withdraw for a while and kind of renew her energies in a way that Frederick Douglass, for instance, was not.
Right, and couldn't, yeah.
Right, Child could blend into New York society. She was living in New York at the time, and no one would harass her, and that would never have been true for Black abolitionists. But then in the 1850s, and especially around John Brown's raid, she's re-energized. So she sees that things are at a breaking point in the country and throws herself again at trying to address them.
Okay, now let's explain John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, just briefly so everyone knows where we are.
On October 16th, 1859, John Brown, who was a white abolitionist, launched a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And he had a small group of men with him, including 5 Black men. And the idea was to take over the armory, get a hold of all the federal government's weapons that were stored there, distribute them to enslaved people all the way through Northern Virginia, and start a slave insurrection. And that insurrection failed. Mm-hmm. John Brown was captured alive. 2 of his sons were killed in the raid, and 2 of the Black men were killed. 2 of the other ones were hanged later. And John Brown was put on trial. And he was also eventually executed for treason. The way his life intersects with Child's is so interesting to me. And it has to do with the fact that Child was what was then called a non-resistant abolitionist. And that
what does that, okay, so you were about to say, so
yes.
I was going to say, what does that mean?
Right. So that meant, this was true of William Lloyd Garrison too. These were people who believed that force should never be used ever, really, but not even in attempts to end slavery. So it was like pacifism in a way, but that they were committed to this idea that it required a moral transformation to end slavery. You had to convince people that it was wrong. If you just were engaged in violence and forced them to give it up, it would never really end. And of course, Child, I think, would feel vindicated now to see that we had a war and we still have many of the entrenched problems about racial injustice today. But anyway, so she was on the record objecting to any violence, even in the pursuit of the end of slavery.
Right.
So she had to disapprove of what Brown had done.
What he'd done in Kansas and what he'd done at Harper's Ferry.
Exactly, because he killed people.
Yes,
and he was very clear about it. He was unapologetic about that. He essentially said, the system of enslavement kills people, so an eye for an eye. And if people get killed ending slavery, then so be it. So she reacted to this, first with horror that he had used violence, but she and Garrison also were so riveted by and energized by the fact that Brown had put his life on the line in a way that they wanted other people to do. And also, I think Garrison, quite frankly, sensed a press opportunity. Brown had riveted the country's attention on the subject of slavery in a new way. Everybody was talking about it. Yeah. So then Child was left with the question, what to do, what she could do in response to this raid. And what she decided to do was write to John Brown, who was then in prison, and ask to come and nurse him. And in doing that, she also wrote to the governor of Virginia, whose name was Henry Wise.
Right.
He asked for his permission to come and nurse John Brown, which you have to admit was a pretty audacious request, right? John Brown killed a bunch of Virginians and had hoped to kill many more. But so Governor Wise wrote back and he said, of course, we're not at war with Massachusetts. Come down if you'd like. But he took some time to lecture her a little bit. He said, it's your fault, you abolitionists. You've riled people like Brown up to the point that they're willing to be violent. And then he sent his letter to her. And then he decided to do something else. He decided to publish both his letter and hers in the newspaper.
Oh.
And so the next thing she knew, her words to him, which she had intended to be private, were, as she put it, blazoned across Virginia newspapers. I don't think he really knew who he was tangling with because she had contacts in the press as well. So she wrote a scathing response. It's really worth reading. It's so relentless and brutal, and published it as well in Horace Greeley's newspapers in New York. She makes it very clear to him that she and many Northerners would be thrilled if they would finally make good on their threat of secession. And so she kind of ratchets the war of words up one. This letter got the attention of a person named Mrs. Mason, about whom more anon, who wrote a response to that letter in the newspaper, in which she attacks Child personally. She says, "Do you read your Bible, Mrs. Child? How dare you support this insurrectionist?" And then she says, "We buy our servants clothing," and by servants she meant enslaved people. "We tend to them when they're sick. We help the mothers when they're in childbirth. You in the North do none of that for your workers. So don't, essentially don't come calling us immoral." So Child, of course, takes that as another opportunity to publish another letter, which is an 11-page screed. And it encapsulates all of the arguments that Child had been making her whole career, which is 30 years long by this point. And it ends, close to the end, she says, "We give our servants wages so they can buy their own clothes. We tend to people who are sick. We help mothers who are in childbirth. The difference is we do not sell the babies."
Right. And
this became, that was just widely, I think, considered a real slap, right? She really managed to bring it home and so Child was then deluged by mail from across the country, both fan mail and hate mail in response to this. The American Anti-Slavery Society published that entire correspondence from the first letter to the last as a pamphlet, which then sold 300,000 copies.
Which, by the way, is an enormous number in this period.
Right. That's the equivalent, the 19th century equivalent of going viral.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And there are stories of Union soldiers having it as they then went to war, as a way of helping them understand what they were fighting for. But I want to say one more thing in the spirit of buzzkilling in this interview, which is that your listeners will know that sometimes those of us who write books accidentally perpetuate myths that we then need to correct. And after this book went to print, when I could no longer change anything about it, an author and historian named J.C. Hallman wrote to me with a correction. And this is the correction. The woman who wrote this letter, this screed against Child, was named Mrs. Mason. And for about 4 decades, going back to the official microfiche correspondence of Lydia Maria Child, people have claimed that Mrs. Mason was the wife of Virginia Senator James Mason. And J.C. Hallman has discovered, I think, pretty persuasive evidence that that's not true. There was a Mrs. Mason. She did write the letter. Hallman has found her. We know who she is. Yeah. But it was not the wife of Senator James Mason. So buzzkillers, you can you can help bust that myth. Now, I haven't actually gone back. I haven't had time to go back and look at the documents myself, but the evidence that he's very generously shared with me is pretty convincing to me.
Well, that's a relatively small myth to perpetuate. I mean, imagine that's just a clause in one of your sentences.
There's a couple paragraphs, I'm afraid.
About his wife. Okay.
Yes, about the James Mason family.
Okay. Well, when the paperback version comes out, you can correct it, and then when the movie script is written, you can correct it.
From your mouth to God's ears. Yes.
Yeah, but there's another thing about the John Brown story. I mean, to correct me if I'm wrong about this. is it true that she wrote and asked to go to take care of John Brown while he was in prison?
Yeah, it's curious, but he was wounded in the raid for sure. And there were all kinds of rumors about how badly he was wounded. And she just thought it would be a kind of mission of humanity to go and tend for him, even though I think it was clear to everyone that he was going to be executed.
Right.
She still wanted to make his remaining days in the world as bearable as possible. It turned out that he didn't even want her to come. He did write back to her, and he asked her instead to try to help raise money for his soon-to-be widow and the widows of his sons, which Child did. And Child also managed not to forget that the families of the Black men who had been killed also needed attention, which most people quickly forgot.
Well, we don't want to give away her entire life because there are a lot of entire life and work, because there are a lot of other things that Buzzkillers should know about, and this is why they should get the book. It's of course out this month. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. I'm talking about her arguments for Native American rights, her arguments for free thinking and sort of ecumenical understanding of different religions, and on and on and on. So, let's leave that for our listeners to read on their own. What happens to her as the war's going on, and then as her life sort of comes to an end?
Yeah, she was very, very engaged throughout the entire war. She refused to support Union troops as long as Union troops were being used to return enslaved people who had fled.
Right.
And that happened a lot at the beginning of the war. It was part of Lincoln's attempt to convince the border states who hadn't seceded not to secede. He wanted to prove to them that the quote unquote property that they held in humans would be respected. So when enslaved people fled across Union lines and tried to take refuge at Union forts, they were often, let's think about this. Taxpayer dollars were used to return them to their enslavers.
Yes, as had happened under the Fugitive Slave Act as well.
Exactly, right. So it was just a kind of extension of that.
Yeah.
So she refused to do anything to support the Union effort as long as that was happening. But once there were a couple of Union generals who were abolitionists, she, organized knitting parties and sewed clothing for them. She also, very early on, was doing everything she could to provide for the needs of what were called freedmen, or free people, so enslaved people who had crossed lines and were no longer enslaved. One of the things I love most about her is that she was determined to get them books. So she would stitch together copies of The Liberator and send them to they're called contraband camps. Where these people were. One of her very best friends was Sarah Gould Shaw, who was the mother of Robert Gould Shaw, who was the man who was at the head of the troop of Black soldiers who attacked Fort Wagner in South Carolina. She continued to write. She continued to argue in every publication that would publish anything she wrote for not just the end of slavery, but the end of prejudice. She was very clear that unless Northerners especially could change their prejudices, similar problems would surface as soon as the war was over. And indeed, I hate to say this, but I think she died pretty despondent at what had happened in Reconstruction.
Yes, a lot of people were very despondent.
Yeah, so she died in 1880, which was plenty of time to see that Andrew Johnson had been a complete disaster. But she continued to try to write about that. As you said, she went back to arguing against the genocide of Native Americans that was happening, and just generally continued to be an energetic reformer in whatever way seemed most pressing to her.
Well, that gets us to the end of her life, Professor. And again, we can't encourage the Buzzkillers enough to get the book. We should say that the University of Chicago Press has sent us an advance copy, and that one of our Patreon members will be able to win that copy. So they know what to do. The emails go out to them. But I have two more questions for you. One is sort of methodological, and that is, you're a philosophy professor.
Guilty as charged.
What attracted you to go into this particular history?
I had been happily working on German philosophy for my whole career. I'm a Hegel scholar. I've written a couple of books about the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel. But after the election of 2016, I felt like I needed to come home, as it were. I felt like I needed to learn more about my own history, and I felt like I needed guidance as to how people at other points of American history had addressed moral emergencies. in their country. And I had a distant memory that women had been very influential in the abolitionist movement. And I had an intuition that in order to fight an entrenched evil for your whole life, you would have to think philosophically.
Right.
You would have to ask big questions like, what is justice? What is equality? What is it to be a human? And you'd also have to confront a lot of the arguments that moral philosophers are very familiar with, like what makes moral change?
Yeah.
Is it an appeal to people's feelings, or is it an appeal to their rational capacities? What do you do if your own good has to be sacrificed for the cause of a greater good? Like just classic philosophical problems. And so I thought, well, I'd like to find someone through whom I could think about the philosophical foundations of abolitionism, and I would like that person to be a woman.
Right.
And I pretty literally stumbled on something by her and was just electrified by her writing and her example. It turns out, believe it or not, that she was a fan of some of the Germans that I spent my career writing about. She
interesting.
really appreciated German philosophy and German drama. She was a fan of Friedrich Schiller, for instance. So there were many more parallels than I could have guessed. But I essentially was looking for someone to help me think through what I felt like my moral obligations are as a citizen in a moment when it feels to me like my country is in crisis. And she wasn't a perfect example. There are many things that I've learned from her about mistakes and things I want to avoid doing, but she really has helped me think that through in my own case.
Well, then that leads me to my final question, and it really is two questions, and I'm stealing this from the book's website, from the promotional material about the book. So let me ask you just to sum up, and this is so great because you're the only philosophy professor we've ever had on the show.
I'm honored.
There are two big questions. And as you say, these are perfectly suited for our own times in this 21st century. What does it mean to change your life when the moral future of your country is at stake? And when confronted by sanctioned evil and systematic injustice, how should a citizen live? So how has your work on Lydia Maria Child helped answer these questions or furthered your understanding of these questions?
Well, I think that the question of how should a citizen live in a moment of moral emergency, I don't want to exaggerate too much because the problems that we're dealing with now are also chronic. It's not like things just suddenly got bad. There have been very bad things for a very long time. I think one of the things that I learned from her was take stock of your talents, your resources, what you're good at, and then ask yourself, how can I devote those things to this crisis? And then push yourself. Mm-hmm. So don't just stop and say, okay, well, I'm, a writer, so I'll write something. She did all kinds of things that were way outside her comfort zone that allowed her to expand what she was able to do effectively. But I also think she's a really good example of someone who didn't rush in an uninformed way. When she converted to abolitionism, the first thing she did was go away for about 3 years and research and think and write.
Right.
She learned, right? She didn't just throw herself at the barricades. She tried to be responsible about that. And I think many Americans, and I put myself in this category for sure, just need to know more about how injustice operates and its history and its current incarnations and all of the ways in which we sustain it, whether we're aware of it or not. She was also wonderful at what I like to call a kind of fierce humility. She was very aware that she was part of the problem and that she was getting things wrong. She was very open to admitting that. So she wasn't going to be fragile and get her feelings hurt and retreat as soon as things got hard or as soon as people disagreed with her. And I really admire that kind of humility as well. And so I guess all of those things to me emphasize that at a moment, if and when it's clear to us, which I think it is, that democracy requires our efforts and requires more engagement than sometimes perhaps in our history, it is time for us to change our lives. And that doesn't have to be overnight. It doesn't have to be you throw everything out the window. But I think it does mean a kind of principled, habitual, daily commitment to learning and acting in ways that take what's actually going on into consideration.
Well, Professor, I can't think of a better way to help the buzzkillers out there have marching orders. We like in this show to bust myths and take names, as you say, but we also want each episode to have a larger message, and I can't imagine a better one than that. So again, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation and for everything that you do to keep us all thinking about history in such buzz-killing ways.
Okay, and buzzkillers out there, don't forget, go to Professor Buzzkill for all the fun. Follow us on all the socials. And if you're a Patreon member, please look out for that email where we'll be offering the free copy of the advanced copy of this wonderful biography. So just thanks again, Professor Moland.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.